Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm back to bring you my February wrap-up. So February was a rough month for a lot of us. It was a tough one for me, I'm not gonna lie, and then of course it had even worse political, global, social implications beyond that, so as of filming this, I'm not in a super great mental space. But one thing I do know how to do is review books, so we're gonna review some books. And as for all the other things going on, down below I will include an updated list of resources. But with that aside, in case you missed it, I did just post a recent reads video where I wrapped up the last 3 books I accidentally read at the end of January and the first 3 books I read for Blackathon. That link will also be included down below as well. That video has reviews for Ramon and Julieta, The Jade Setter of Janloon, The Bronze Beasts, A Soft Place to Land, Digging Up Love, and I'm So Not Over You, so you should definitely check it out. Today I'm going to be talking about the rest of the books I read for February and Blackathon with the exception of one review book. I also wanted to point out that I did not choose a team for Blackathon because in true Libra fashion I wanted to read a little bit of everything and I also did not want to make a choice. So picking up right where I left off, the next book I listened to was Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America by Ijeoma Oluo, read by the author herself. This is historical, political, social nonfiction. It is a condensed, comprehensive examination of how white men have centered themselves in American society and the events and circumstances that have led to their consolidation of power across various systems. This book covers about a century of United States history, and it's a sort of response to the 2016 election attempting to answer the question of how we, as a society, got to this point. General content warnings for references to sexual harassment, pedophilia, and sexual violence, discussions of white supremacy, racism, police brutality, hate crimes, and reported racial and sexual slurs, explorations of genocide, anti-indigenous violence, war crimes, and chattel slavery, explorations of misogyny, deportation, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, and some descriptions of online harassment, domestic terrorism, suicide, and gun violence. I'm just gonna say this up front, I am not gonna do this book justice. There is no way I can possibly summarize everything this book covers in the next 2 to 3 minutes. It cannot be done. And frankly, the fact that this book condenses a century's worth of American history into less than 300 pages is a tremendous feat. This is not a book explaining how white male mediocrity functions, how it is expressed, or how it manifests itself in modern day life. Rather, it's a reframing of this country's history to better understand how our current systems were built. The answer as to who white mediocrity benefits is obvious, so instead the book takes an unflinching look at who is then left outside of the margins, and it poses a lot of deeply uncomfortable, deeply revealing questions about who is being gatekept out of existence. I actually heard about this book in a queer support group, and it came up because we were discussing how patriarchy informs and dictates so many of the ideas, norms, and systems that limit our existence. And so I found reading through this to be cathartic because it provides that language and foundational knowledge to better express those disparities. It covers everything from colonialism to discrimination in the workplace and higher education, the lingering effects of slavery, the rise of Bernie Bros, and even how American football has become an exploitation of black bodies. So there's really an incredible range of topics. A lot of the information in this is definitely traumatic and sometimes discouraging, especially when you're processing it as a marginalized person, but I still think it's essential reading for Americans especially because it touches on so much history that we often don't get taught. So I think it's a book that requires a lot of time and reflection, and I would also say to not go into it expecting answers or suggestions for where we go from here, because frankly, it's not the author's job to provide those solutions. This is about sitting with the history, taking in the information, looking at the hard facts, and figuring out for ourselves how these circumstances have fit into and continue to shape our lives. My one critique is more of an observation, and that's how the book is very binary in nature and how the author typically uses women and people of color as the sort of catch-all phrase to address people who are impacted by patriarchy, which I don't think is entirely accurate. It's also disabled people, it's people of different genders, people who live in poverty, people who are neurodivergent, and so many other folks. To be clear, I don't think that's necessarily the author's fault, at least when it comes to the sources cited in the book, because a lot of statistical data is still not collected in a way that's truly inclusive, but I do wish that she had used some different language. The other thing I noticed was that the chapters can get a little niche at times, a little ultra-specific, and that hyper-focus made me wonder if instead there could have been more room to explore even more concepts. But those are just very minor notes. I still took away so much from this book and I gave it 4 stars. After that I picked up 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. I think this would technically be classified as a hard-hitting contemporary black romance. It's about these 2 best-selling authors who met as teenagers during an incredibly traumatizing time in their lives, and they spent 7 days together and then proceeded to write incarnations incarnations of each other in all of their books. Years and years later, they run into each other at a professional event, and that passion is reignited between them. So they're both trying to figure out whether a relationship between them is ultimately sustainable, while also struggling to confront their trauma and the ways they both deeply hurt each other in the past. Content warnings for graphic depictions of chronic pain, migraines, blood, and vomit, some experiences of racism, ableism, and violence, exploration of predatory adults, sexual assault and abuse, some exploration of alcoholism, drug use, drug addiction, overdose, and death, graphic depictions of self-harm, specifically cutting, suicide ideation, and suicide attempts, as well as explicit sexual content, graphic injury, and HP references. Before I get into it, I do want to say that Chanel from Chanel Time recently hosted a live discussion for this book as part of her book club, and she discusses it with 2 other Black reviewers. So I will include that discussion down below because they touch on so many parts of this story that I could never properly address. I really love what they had to say about the book, and they talk more in depth about the strong Black woman complex and the dynamic between Black women and their mothers. Again, things that I am not personally qualified to talk about, so you should definitely check that out if you want to learn even more about this book. This story is a difficult one to talk about because it tackles so many complex conversations about deep-seated trauma, toxic coping mechanisms, and how family dynamics change across multiple generations. It's also tricky because this is technically a romance, and a Black romance at that, because it has all the components that are quote-unquote required of a romance, but it's also not a fluffy, happy-go-lucky romance because, like I said, when it comes to exploring graphic trauma, it goes pretty hard in the paint. So there's a lot of conversations as to whether this qualifies as a romance or not, and while I don't really have a horse in that race, I also think it's worth reflecting on whether we get to police romance as a genre that's strictly feel-good and positive and nothing else. On the same token, I think it would also be a mistake to reduce this story as just being a second chance romance when it's really asking a deeper question not only about whether these characters may have initially met at the wrong place, wrong time, but also if after all these years there even is such a thing as the right time and place. Have they truly done enough healing and growing to make sense as a couple, or are they only ever destined to have these short-lived, passionate, all-consuming affairs before going their separate ways? Their relationship was really born of trauma, something they used to escape what they were going through, or maybe even exacerbate it, and the question is whether it can now become a source of joy and strength and comfort. That, of course, is easier said than done. It's not just a matter of reconnecting with an old flame, it's about how a person can become a site of pain and memory and trauma, and whether time and distance can ever truly divorce them from that context. In a lot of ways, I think the story is also about how perfection doesn't exist, and how there's a freedom that comes with revealing yourself as a deeply flawed, messy, struggling, uncertain person who is still deserving and worthy of love and good things. These 2 characters are far, far, far from perfect, and so is their relationship. So the question becomes, how can they love each other, but also more importantly, how can they learn to love themselves through all of those difficulties and not in spite of them? So is this an easy book to read? No, it's not. The content warnings I gave should be taken very seriously, but it does also have warmth, humor, steaminess, and even hope, and I respect how the author is able to shape this story into something so complex. I still think the relationship itself is quite a bit toxic, and I found there to be maybe 1 too many perspectives, so if I was being nitpicky, I would say this was a solid 3.75 stars, but I'm okay with rounding that up to 4 stars. Then my one review book that wasn't for Blackathon was Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. This just came out on February 22nd from Berkeley. It's a sapphic adult romance about Delilah, who left her small town behind many years ago after her father passed away, and her stepfamily made her feel very unwanted. So she went to New York to pursue photography, and she's never really gone back. But now her stepsister Astrid is getting married, and her mom hired Delilah to photograph all of the events leading up to the wedding, and because Delilah could really use the money, as much as she hates the idea, she really can't refuse. So she goes back to Bright Falls, and she runs into Claire Sutherland, who is a single mom, a bookshop owner, and one of Astrid's best friends. As Delilah becomes begrudgingly more entrenched in this friend group while she photographs them, the more she starts falling for Claire, and the 2 of them realize that they might not actually want this wedding to happen in the first place. Content warnings for some explorations of parental death, childhood trauma, abandonment, parental neglect, depression, and grief, mention of a past partner's infidelity, mention of cancer, brief reference to blood, and some explicit sexual content. Before I forget, I also want to point out that pretty much no one in this story is straight. I had a really good feeling about this book when I first heard the announcement. Ashley Herring Blake has written so many phenomenal sapphic middle grade books that have instantly become favorites for me, so I knew I would most likely enjoy this, and I did. I love romances that are more than just just romance, and I think this story is definitely one of those. Delilah isn't just falling for a childhood acquaintance in her hometown, but she's also having to confront this emotional void that exists between her and Astrid, as well as the pain and grief she dealt with alone as a child, and finally piece together how that might contribute to her inability to commit. It's funny because this is not at all a second chance romance, but it might just be a story that's about second chance sisterhood and friendship, if that makes sense. Growing up, Delilah was dismissed, ignored, and taunted by Astrid and her friends because her grief was seen as inconvenient and because it didn't manifest in easy ways. So she never really got to have that connection with her family and her sister's friends, but now as an adult who's much more confident and self-assured and who knows exactly who she is, she's finally getting that chance. But at the same time, I love that Delilah is so unapologetic and in your face. She is not subtle or gracious or zen. She is going to raise hell and cause trouble and drag her feet every step of the way leading up to this wedding, and she does not care what anyone else thinks. It's almost cathartic to read because she made herself very small after losing her father as a child, and now she has painstakingly recovered her drive and her voice, and she is not about to relapse back into silence. So in a way, the story is about making amends, reconnecting with your home and your family, finding love, all of those things, but it's also got plenty of wedding sabotage shenanigans, which is way more fun than you would think. The story makes it very clear that Astrid's fiancé is a not good guy, so it's not like you're actively rooting against her happiness or anything like that, so it is entertaining to watch Delilah make a complete mess of things. But like I said, what I think is so satisfying about this story is that it provides that full circle moment where Delilah is unknowingly making those genuine connections with Astrid's friends as they conspire together, and she's getting that feeling of being wanted and included in a way that she never got to experience. Claire is also a really great love interest because she's trying to navigate her own trust issues and balance that against raising her kid and wanting to create a healthy dynamic where she and her ex can successfully co-parent. Sadly, it's still noteworthy in traditional romances to have romantic leads who are parents and who are on that journey of finding love and realizing that they are desirable and that they have so much life and so much love to offer someone else. So overall, this story is funny, it's entertaining, it's sexy, but it also balances those journeys of healing and reconciliation in really wonderful ways. I really enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. After that, from my library, I listened to Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby, read by Adam Lazar-White. You might recall that I brought this book up in my Heist Books video, which is actually what made me want to finish it. So it's a gritty, intense crime thriller about Beauregard, also known as Bug, who is a former getaway driver turned honest small-town mechanic. Not only is business incredibly bad with a competing garage opening multiple storefronts, but his sick mother's healthcare is also being terminated, his oldest child is struggling to figure out how to pay for college, and all of these financial hardships are compounding all at once. Desperate to make ends meet, Bug accepts one last job stealing a collection of diamonds that should theoretically make all of his money problems vanish. However, when things quickly go south, Bug realizes this jewelry store is actually a front for something far, far worse that could destroy everything and everyone he loves. Content warnings for instances of racism and some fat phobia, as well as racial, sexual, and ableist slurs, explorations of parental abandonment, instances of drug use, drug addiction, and abduction, brief reference to human trafficking and past drunk driving, graphic depictions of pain, injury, blood, violence, vehicular trauma, murder, and gun violence, some references to cancer, job insecurity, and past animal death, and some references to sex acts. This was my first foray into S.A. Cosby's work, and I can definitely say that it will not be my last. This is a dynamic, intense, fast-paced story that is such a shining example of what incredible storytelling looks like. S.A. Cosby is so good at guiding the reader's eye, so to speak, to these really compelling details and moments. The first chapter of this book, I think, is like a textbook example of what a perfect opening chapter should do. It immediately grabs your attention, it perfectly sets the tone and reveals so much about the main character, and it very quickly makes the reader feel invested in the stakes. When all is said and done, this is a heist story, so of course it's high octane, it's exciting, it's gripping, but I think what makes it so special is the voice. There's such a distinctive, decisive point of view and tone that underlies everything in this story. The narrative voice really captures that vibrant, personable, identifiably Southern everyday man dialect with such clarity and power that it's hard not to believe it. And on that note, I think the audiobook narrator, Adam Lazar-White, really knocks it out of the park and delivers such a dynamic performance. You can really feel and hear the laughter, the sorrow, the frustration, the desperation in his voice when it's called for, and he really brings so much life to the characters. As you can tell from the synopsis, this story is incredibly dramatic and intense, but it also delivers on those quieter moments when the characters are just weighing their choices and trying to figure out what to do next. At the end of the day, this story is about a struggling black man who's a husband, a father, and trying to figure out what kind of man he wants to be, how he can provide a life of dignity, and what kind of legacy he wants to pass on to his kids. The story definitely explores intergenerational trauma, violence, and toxic masculinity, especially with Bug's own father being a getaway driver himself, which led him to abandon his own family just to keep them safe. So when you see that as a viable option growing up, how does that impact you? And how does that intersect with society's expectation that you're already guilty of something just for existing? What do you do when the world doesn't afford you dignified choices? The other major thread running throughout this story is the question of what it means to be free. For Bug, freedom means the ability to choose for yourself, even if you're ultimately making a bad choice. Throughout the story, he's struggling to figure out whether a good man can also be a criminal or vice versa, what that even means, and what it costs to be a good man according to unrealistic, unhealthy, white patriarchal norms and expectations. And the way this heist goes south is really indicative of the bigger picture where the world isn't just demanding Bug's labor and time and money and struggle, but really how it demands every last thing he has as the price tag for his existence. While the story can be a little bit gratuitous or self-indulgent at times, it still packs a hell of a punch. It has phenomenal action sequences. You can tell the author is very knowledgeable about cars and what they can do. The story really keeps you on your toes with a heist within a heist, and I also appreciate how the story doesn't leave Bug in an easy place. Like I said, I would definitely read more from this author in the future, and I gave this one a solid 4 stars. Then my Patreon pick for February was Sorrowland by River Solomon, and I used my library to listen to the audiobook read by Karen Chilton. This is River Solomon's latest book that Faye released last year. It's a queer gothic SFF story about Vern, who narrowly escapes a religious extremist compound at the tail end of her pregnancy and ends up giving birth to twins alone in the forest. She decides to raise her children in the forest, but finds that she is not only being hunted by the compound, but she's also experiencing these hallucinations, and her body is changing and strengthening in really disturbing ways. So she not only wants to protect her family, but also put an end to this extremist group while also trying to understand and gain control over her strange metamorphosis. Content warnings for graphic childbirth and references to child death and animal death, in-depth explorations of drugging, drowning, and murder, graphic instances of self-harm, cutting, burning, blood, pain, body horror, graphic injury, and violence, reported suicide, ableism, misogyny, fatphobia, and homophobia, some references to parental neglect, forced sterilization, human experimentation, sexual assault, and predatory adults, and some graphic sexual content. It's also worth mentioning that Vern is a queer, intersex, non-cis, albino black person with low vision and chronic pain, and the story also has a queer, trans Lakota love interest. I've loved everything I've read by River Solomon, and this book is no exception. It can definitely be intense at times, so again, please heed the content warning seriously, but I think the payoff is well worth it. What stood out to me immediately was the main character, Vern. She is driven, determined, and decisive in what she believes. Especially having grown up surrounded by manipulation and lies, she knows that she can't really put her trust in other people, so she is going to depend on herself and make her own way, even if she has virtually no support. It takes an incredibly strong person to be their own foundation, to create a way of living that is entirely their own, and to purposefully forsake all the norms and expectations of the outside world, even if the end result is complete alienation. There's a lot of really compelling ideas in this story. One of them is that this religious extremist group refers to themselves as black supremacists, or basically the extreme opposite of white supremacists. And while you might think that it's a utopia for black folks, as evidenced by Vern's escape, it's really not. So that's really interesting because when you consider their manipulation and the way they experimented on the people living there to the point where Vern is violently metamorphosing, it makes you think about the dynamic of intra-community violence. But this terrifying metamorphosis also serves as a deeper reflection of this country's history, willingness, and vested interest in enacting violence upon black bodies. And that leads to another compelling concept in this story, which relates to how these experiments are intended to result in people who are powerful and strong. But then seeing how these changes affect Vern, it makes you question whether those things are actually advantages. Again, it brings to mind the idea of the strong black woman complex, of people who are not allowed to show pain or fatigue or struggle, who are always expected to be exceptional and capable no matter the circumstances, which is extremely unsustainable and toxic. With Vern growing so strong to the point where she can no longer detect pain or realize when she's hurting someone else, is that actually a benefit? Is that actually empowering? Is that actually an advantage? I think that's a really powerful statement, how this thing that's supposed to make her powerful and more than human in theory is actually taking away her ability to feel, which is a key component of existence. It also leaves her in this place where she's trying to figure out what to do with those abilities. What was that power intended for, and how can she use it for good, if it can even be used for good? And that in itself is another burden, because now she has to figure out how this thing she did not choose for herself can then be transformed and used in service. That is perhaps what I appreciate most about this story, that it does not romanticize the idea of healing. Rather, it shows how healing yourself and healing other people, especially when it comes to addressing severe generational trauma, requires an enormous amount of energy, labor, and time, which are not boundless resources. I'm just barely scratching the surface here. This story is doing so many incredible things when it comes to exploring trauma, being haunted by the past, living with the consequences of violence, and finding new ways to live. It made me think about all these things I've discussed and so much more, and I'm going to be thinking about it for quite some time. I gave this one 4.5 stars. So those are the rest of the books I read in February. I'm still doing Pondathon, of course, and so this was my terrarium at the end of January, and this is what it looks like now with all the new plants. I'm going to keep moving things around, of course, but I'm really proud of it. As always, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to stop by the comments down below and let me know what you think. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, genuinely, please educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.